Hey everybody, welcome to my first of two videos on this, the Minolta X-370, one of the single most underrated entry-level cameras ever made. The Minolta X-370 in some markets was also called the X-300, so they're the same camera. This is an interchangeable lens, 35mm SLR, meaning that the lenses can come off and be put back on at any point. You can change lenses mid-roll, it's no problem. This has a center-weighted meter, meaning that an area about the size of what's inside of my finger box there governs the majority of the metering input. So I think with Minoltas it's about 60% here, and then 40% of the metering data comes from everything else. That's really good if your subject is generally centrally placed. That's a very solid metering system. It's also very good for general photography. Center-weighted is a very good system in general. The shutter speeds on this camera are from bulb, it's the wrong way, which is indicated by a B on the shutter speed dial, from 1 second then up to 1,000th of a second, and automatic mode. Automatic means the camera chooses the best shutter speed for you. The viewfinder in this camera has 0.9x magnification, meaning that what you see and hear is 90% of the size that it will be on the film, and then it has 95% frame coverage, meaning that on each side, in the top and the bottom, you lose about 2.5% of the frame that's going to appear on the film in the viewfinder. And that's just fine as long as what is inside of your viewfinder is what you want to have a picture of. That little bit of loss gives you some cropping options, either digitally or in the darkroom. It has a split prism focusing screen, and let's see if I can get that here. There we go. And what that means is that in the center there's a little circle that's two prisms, and then it's surrounded by a circle of smaller prisms that are just standard prisms, and then the rest of the screen is a matte field screen. And in the second video I'll explain how to focus with this camera and how to read what is inside of the viewfinder. The target market for the Minolta X-370 was entry level. It's the most basic model of the X series, and it lacks a lot of the things like a depth of field preview lever that the X500 and X570 have, and it also lacks program mode that the X700 has. For instance, it can use a motor drive, which is nice, and it does not have an interchangeable film back. So the back on this is fixed. Sort of. I'll tell you how to get past that. These were made by Minolta Camera Company in Japan from 1984 till 1990. And you can see there on the bottom it says it was made in Japan. It was preceded by the XG1N, and it was concurrent with the 570, also the 500, which is the same camera, different name, the X600 and the X700. It was followed by the X300S and the X9. Both of those cameras were derivatives of this one. So let's go through the camera's buttons and stuff. We'll start technically on the front with the strap lugs. This is where you would attach your camera strap. Here on the top we have the film rewind knob. This is what you would use to rewind your film. This black ring here is the ISO selection dial. In order to adjust your ISO, you have to push this black button, which is the lock, and then you can adjust your ISO. This is the on-off switch. When your camera is off, it will still drain batteries, so you need to remove the batteries from it if you're going to not use it even for a week or two. Flash hot shoe with the serial number. Here we have the window that tells you what your shutter speed is, and that red line is the indicator. But you'll know because you can only see one number at a time in there. Shutter release, film advance button, frame count window, and that indicator turns orange as you use the film to show you how much of the film you have used. On the camera's front, we have the self timer, which you activate by pulling up, and auto exposure lock, which you activate by pushing down. We'll talk about how to use auto exposure lock in the second video. This is the aperture linkage. As you move the aperture ring on your lens, it moves this ring, and that tells the camera what aperture you're set at. That's your lens mount index dot. It's on the lens mount itself. There, over here is a cable release port on the side. This is your lens release button right here. On the back of the camera, we have a film memo window. When you take your film out of the box, you tear the tab off and put it in there to know what type of film you have. The ASA DIN conversion, not really so useful anymore since everybody uses ISO now. And the ASA number is the exact same number as the ISO. This is the viewfinder window, and on the edges of it there are some grooves so that you can put some accessories in. On the camera's bottom we have the electrical contacts for the motor drive. The battery chamber, we'll see how to take batteries out and put new ones in the second video. Tripod bushing, made in Japan. Film rewind release button, and the mechanical coupling for the motor drive. On the inside, we have the film cassette chamber right here where you will put the film when you unload it. A film guide pin that helps the film come out of the cassette smoothly. The top and bottom are film guide rails that help guide the film and prevent it from moving up and down as it travels. The inner ones are film guide rails that are sandwiched with the pressure plate here to help keep the film flat on plane. We have the shutter here. This is the film tension sprocket. It's moving freely right now because I hit the film rewind button, but normally it only spins in this direction and prevents the film from being pulled backwards after it's advanced past the shutter. Film take-up spool right here. There we go. That's how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to not go backwards. This little doodad here fits right there and helps put some pressure on the film so that it doesn't hop the sprockets. The film pressure plate, which goes right here to keep the film flat, and then this little spring right there is a cassette retention spring that helps hold the film cassette in place. The film backs on these are not good. If you've seen the 570 or the 700, they have removable film backs that have a power grip here. So these are not removable film backs. However, if you want the improved ergonomics that come with a 700 or a 500 film back, you can take the bottom plate off by unscrewing it at the screws, and that gives you access to the little metal loop that this bottom pin fits in. If you're very careful and you work it a little bit, you can bend it enough to pull this film back out, bend it back into shape, and then you can take the 500 back, or 700 back, which is intended to be removable, and then put it into the 300 or the 370. And that gives you the improved ergonomics of the 500, 570, and 700 cameras. Well worth doing that if you are careful not to break that bottom loop off, because if you break that bottom loop, you won't be able to get the film back of any kind onto the camera. You'll have ruined your camera. So only do that if you're really confident about it. I've done that on a couple of these, and it makes a huge, huge difference. So some notes on the Minolta X-370, like the Pentax K1000. This was designed to be an entry-level camera, and it is super underrated. The only thing I think this camera is missing that it should have is a flash PC port. The 500, 570, same camera. The 500 and 570 are the same camera, and the 700, I believe, also have it over here. If this had a flash PC port, it would be basically perfect for starting. It has a hot shoe. We'll talk a little bit more about in the second video about the drawbacks of this and how to use it. But a PC port would have made this perfect. These are really great cameras that can do 99.9% of anything you would ever want to do photographically, just as they are. These cameras do have a weakness, however. It's the same as all of the X cameras, and that's in their capacitors. Their capacitors are, I think, over on this side right here underneath the bottom plate. If you buy one of these and you put batteries in and the mirror stops partway up, it would look about like this, typically, or the shutter simply wouldn't fire. That tends to be an indicator that you have a bad capacitor. There are some good videos on how to replace it. The capacitors are, I don't know, 80 cents a piece right now in 2019. They're really cheap, and soldering them is pretty easy. I've replaced capacitors on a handful of these. It takes about 15-20 minutes once you've done a couple. But if your X370 or 300 isn't firing, it's worth trying to replace the capacitor as a first step rather than getting rid of the camera or sending it in for a full overhaul. Unless there's something more serious that's obviously wrong with it. This differs from the X570, which is the next step up from this, only in that it lacks a PC port and has some cosmetic differences. If you've seen my X500, X570 video, I go over some of the cosmetic differences on the top plate. Stupidly, I already put that camera away for the night. Anyway, also the 570 has a swappable film back. Those are really the differences. If you want to have the different interface here, or you have to have a flash PC port or a swappable film back, this camera is not for you, and the 570 is worth looking at. This camera has an amazing viewfinder by entry-level standards. It's as good as the mid-range and better viewfinders for Minolta, and it's better than the viewfinders for any of the comparable generation of entry-level cameras from the other makers, with a possible exception of Olympus, but this one is really, really wonderful to use and to look through. So, some things not to do with your camera. Don't store this camera with the shutter ready to fire. So if you're going to put this away for even just a week, you want to trigger the shutter before you do that, because the shutter mechanism has springs, and if you store it with the springs under tension, they're not going to be as springy when they go to do their shutter motion next time, and it will affect your shutter performance. The other thing is, don't touch the shutter curtain itself in the back. It's a really good way to brick your camera. And this also, don't touch the mirror that's in here, because the oils from your finger can tarnish it, which can affect metering and make it harder to focus through your viewfinder. Don't leave your camera or your lenses in your car, because heat can cause the oils in your lens especially, but also in the camera, to get really thin and then get into places they shouldn't be. And then when they cool down, they get back to their normal viscosity, and for instance, the aperture leaves on this lens could be affected, and they could be slow and not work properly. Other elements of the camera body could not work properly if that happens. Also, the cold can make the oils very thick and gummy, so that they break down and they get thick, and then they don't lubricate and work properly. The other thing is, if you leave it in your car, it's a good way to come back to your car and have a broken window and no camera. So even if you're just, popping into the bank really quickly to deposit your many, many millions of dollars that you made that day, taking photographs with your X370, take the camera with you. Don't leave it in your car, because that's just a good way to have a lot of expenses and problems that you don't want to have. Don't store your cameras in plastic bags or boxes. I will admit I use Pelican boxes, which are plastic, but I use rechargeable desiccant packs in them to help make sure that the moisture is absorbed by the desiccant. And that's okay to do. But don't just wrap this in a plastic bag and set it on your shelf, because moisture will permeate the bag, and it can cause fungus to grow on the lens elements and in the leather and in the optical portion of the prism in the camera. That's a really good way to ruin your camera. And also, don't let this get wet. It's an entry-level camera. It's not in any way weather sealed, and water will ruin the electronics in this camera. Just remember, your camera is a precision tool, and as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So that's it for the first video for the X370. In the second video, we'll take a look. We looked at what the buttons were here. In the second video, we're going to talk about what they do, how to do everything you can do out of the box with this camera. If this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm on the right track and that I'm making content which is helpful and useful to you. If you'd like to find out when I have more photography, camera type videos released, click on the subscribe button below and turn on the notifications, and then you'll find out when I have more videos that come out. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments, and I'm pretty good about responding within a couple of days. If you're an amateur photographer who has taken photos with a Minolta X-370 or 300, feel free to leave a link to those photos in the comments section. And one last thing, thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the second video.